The Navy needed a fleet oiler in a hurry and looked towards the commercial tanker industry for assistance. In 1939, the Navy purchased the 553-foot tanker Cimarron from the Standard Oil Company.
She was a very unusual ship. She was fairly large, but more importantly, she had twin screws. It's a very fast ship with a bulbous bow. They allowed the ship to have a speed of 18 knots at a time when 14 or 15 knots was the norm for a fast commercial tanker. And this speed was very important because this would allow the ship to steam with the fleet.
The Cimarron became the prototype fleet oiler for the Navy. When the U.S. entered the war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Cimarron class quickly distinguished itself in the battle for the Pacific.
The real significance of the Cimarron class was that it permitted the United States to conduct the famous carrier raids that we're all familiar with. It's a little known fact that every one of those raids was accompanied by an oiler. And this was because the destroyers all had to be refueled at sea because they had limited range vessels.
In addition to refueling at sea, the U.S. military needed to transfer millions of gallons of oil to the thousands of tanks, trucks, and planes that would be needed in Europe and along the Pacific fronts.
Tankers were always a prime target of U-boats because they're important ships. Their cargo was important, so whenever a submarine saw a tanker, it would always go after it.
The Allied forces were faced with the challenge of building tankers faster than the Axis powers could sink them. Their answer was the T-2 tanker.
It was a standard design which allowed the ships to be built very quickly.
They actually would construct segments on shore and then bring them to the building yard, and each time they built a tanker, they learned how to build it faster or quicker.
About 525 of them were built throughout the war. They could do about 15 knots. They could carry all forms of petroleum. They were very instrumental in being able to support our forces overseas with large amounts of petroleum products.
By the end of the war, the Navy's oilers and tankers have provided an invaluable lifeline of fuel to the Allied forces. While the oil tanker of World War II had achieved new levels of performance and size, a booming post-war economy was about to give rise to the oil tanker tycoon and the dawn of the supertanker. During the invasion of Okinawa in World War II, oilers delivered over 10 million barrels of fuel oil to the fleet at sea by underway replenishment. Oil tankers will return on Modern Marvels. The end of World War II marked the beginning of unprecedented growth for the United States economy. Post-war Americans wanted to drive fast and travel far. By the early 1950s, American imports of petroleum products exceeded exports for the first time. Oil companies and ambitious entrepreneurs were eager to feed America's high demand for oil and took advantage of a unique opportunity.
After the Second World War, the U.S. government has over 600 tankers of all sorts. The American oil companies put pressure upon the U.S. government to sell off these surplus T-2 tankers. So for about 4 years, the United States sells over 400 of these 600 tankers to American and foreign oil companies.
Many of the T-2 tankers were retrofitted by their new owners so that they could carry more cargo. Using a process called jumboizing, the ships were cut in half, and an extra section was added to the middle, thus doubling the tanker's storage capacity. The 1950s also saw a trio of independent shipping tycoons begin to stake their claim in the burgeoning oil trade. Greek shipping magnates Aristotle Onassis and Stavros Niarchos joined American Daniel Ludwig in an unofficial competition over who could lay claim to the title of owner of the world's largest tanker.
The competition that existed between the various independent owners was probably as much ego as it was economics of the day. There was a lot of status carrying, I now have the world's largest tanker.
American ship owner Daniel Ludwig chose to go overseas to the Kure shipyards in Japan to build his tanker fleet.
That was a surprise to the industry worldwide, because historically the ships were either built in Europe or they were built in the United States. And all of a sudden, Japan came in as a third competitor.
In Japan, Ludwig found a country desperate for industry and a highly skilled workforce with a proud tradition in shipbuilding. As Ludwig began to build his tanker fleet, Greek shipowner Aristotle Onassis grabbed the title of world's largest tanker owner with the launching of the Tina Onassis in 1952. His Greek rival, Stavros Niarchos, bested him in 1955 with the 47,000 deadweight ton vessel, Spiros Niarchos. But it was political instability in the Middle East that would bring tanker tonnage to unprecedented levels. The Suez Canal, which links the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea, provides the shortest shipping route from the oil-rich Middle East to ports in Europe and the United States. In 1956, Egypt nationalized the previously unrestricted passageway. Israel, which relied heavily on the canal for trade, considered this a threat. Joined by Britain and France, Israel declared war on Egypt. The conflict left ships scuttled along the vital waterway, and the canal was closed. Ultimately, the United Nations settled the conflict, and the canal was reopened. But the tanker industry felt it could no longer rely on the political instability of the passageway.
There was a realization that the oil that was moving from the Middle East to Europe, to the United States, had to come around South Africa, around the Cape.
The route around the Cape of Good Hope and then north to Europe or the US added as much as 11,000 miles round trip to a tanker's voyage. To maintain the normal flow of crude to both continents, tanker tonnage had to increase by nearly 100%. The industry was left with two alternatives: either build a large fleet of small vessels or a small fleet of large vessels. The decision came down to the economics of scale.
If you had a box 10 foot by 10 foot by 10 foot, there is a let's call it feet. There's 1,000 feet within that box. If you go 20, 20, and 20, it is 8 times the volume. So it's not linear. By just doubling the size, you create huge amount of volume.
And there was a rush to build a lot of large tankers, super tankers at that time. A large part of the industry said this is the future.
After the closure of the Suez Canal, Daniel Ludwig set the maritime world abuzz by breaking the 100,000 deadweight ton barrier with the launching of the Universe Apollo. The supertanker was born. Around this same time, a dramatic change began to take place in tanker design. The three-tower arrangement that originated with the Glukov was combined into one superstructure, placed at the stern, leaving the entire forward hull for tank space. As maritime engineers began to transform the tanker's design, deadweight tonnage barriers continued to fall.